Can you hear that? Hey, quiet down over there. Man, the acoustics in this room are awful. Well, hey folks, welcome back to another Timber Talk Tuesday. I'm Ricky McLain with WoodWorks. Today we're going to focus on acoustics design for mass timber structures. First, we're going to take a look at how do we actually measure the acoustical performance of any given assembly. How do we specifically design a mass timber assembly for acoustics, making sure that we're limiting the noise that can pass through these different mass timber assemblies. We're going to look at tips and tricks for improving the acoustical performance for mass timber assemblies, and then also take a look at some of the commonly overlooked areas such as flanking, but looking specifically at assembly design. So if you're on the other side of this wall over here, how loud would my voice be to you right now? How effective is that wall assembly or the floor ceiling assembly at blocking the amount of noise that's passing through it? Now, we measure the acoustics performance in two different ways. The first is STC, that stands for Sound Transmission Class. And that is looking at sound that's passing through an assembly, such as voices, TVs, radios, sound that's moving through the airwaves. So STC is a single number rating system. We'll talk in just a minute about how exactly it's calculated. IIC is another type of way we can measure the performance of an assembly. In this particular case, IIC only applies to floor ceiling assemblies, whereas STC applies to both wall assemblies and floor ceiling assemblies. But IIC is standing for Impact Insulation Class, and it's looking specifically at noise that's passing through an assembly through structure-borne vibrations. So think of this most commonly here as somebody walking across the floor above you. You hear those footsteps. That's what we can measure through IIC to see how effective an assembly is at blocking that amount of structure-borne sound. All right, so how do we actually put numbers to these STC and IIC ratings? Well, they are single number rating systems. We do test assemblies, and in most cases, this testing is done at a laboratory. In some cases, you can also do field testing. Essentially, there's a tapping device that is on top of the assembly or on the side of the assembly, and that is obviously making sound, and you're measuring on the opposite side of the assembly the decibel reduction across that assembly. Now, you do that across a wide range of frequencies, low frequency all the way up to high frequency, because, of course, in any individual building, we do have a range of frequencies of sound generating frequencies. So you measure these sound reductions, this decibel reductions across a range of frequencies, you plot that on a chart, and basically what you're doing is you're trying to fit that plotted data closest to one of the predefined curves. You know, STC 38 has a predefined curve, STC 42 has a predefined curve, etc. So you're plotting your actual tested data against the predefined curves. Basically, you're finding which of those predefined curves does your data fit best. So you go through that process and you find, okay, based on our tested data, it fits most closely to whatever the predefined curve is. Let's say STC 45, IIC 45. So that then informs you what your assembly is capable of in terms of its acoustics performance and reducing the amount of noise that passes through that assembly. Now, once you have that information, what does it mean? What do you do with it? Well, this is where you would start to look at what type of building are you designing? Are you an office building, open office building, where maybe there's a lot of noise generated throughout the day, and you're not necessarily concerned with completely blocking all of that sound passing through a wall assembly or a floor ceiling assembly? Opposite end of the spectrum is you're designing a luxury housing project, a condo project. You obviously definitely need the floor ceiling assemblies and wall assemblies in that project to block as much noise as possible. So that's kind of two ends of the spectrum. Of course, most projects fall somewhere in the middle there. The two ends of the spectrum that I mentioned, the open office building, maybe you're shooting for STC IIC of 45, whereas the luxury housing project, maybe you're shooting for STC IIC of 65 to kind of give you a general range. From a code perspective, the code does require that multifamily occupancies, any assembly that's blocking a dwelling unit from a public or service area or a dwelling unit from another dwelling unit, have a minimum STC and IIC of 50. Now, when it comes to specifically designing a mass timber, say, floor panel for acoustics, we need to understand that bare mass timber panel, let's say we have a 5-ply CLT panel, very common. that panel in and of itself is not going to give us adequate acoustics performance. Roughly speaking, a bare 5-ply CLT floor panel has an STC of about 40 and an IIC of about 25. So that's certainly not meeting those code minimums, and especially not even something like an open office building on the low end of the spectrum or luxury housing on the high end of the spectrum. So we need to do something, add something to that bare mass timber floor panel to increase its acoustics performance. Now, this is where it helps to understand what exactly can we do to any assembly, really, not just mass timber, to improve its acoustics performance. Generally speaking, you can do one of three things, or maybe you're doing two or three of these things, but they are adding mass to an assembly, adding decouplers to an assembly, and adding noise barriers or noise absorbers to an assembly. So what are some instances of that? When we're adding mass to an assembly, say again, going back to our mass timber floor panel example, when we're adding mass to that assembly, one common way that we can do this is through the addition of a concrete or gypsum-based poured topping layer. Oftentimes we'll see this for 1, 2, 3 inches thick, and that is a layer that's poured on top of the mass timber panel. Essentially, that's really just adding mass to the assembly, which again helps with its acoustics performance. We can add decouplers, or separating. The idea here is we're separating the finish on one side of the assembly from the structure and or the finish on the opposite side of the assembly. So instead of just having our mass timber panel and then our poured concrete layer directly on top, where that's a hard connection between the two, in between them, we would usually place an acoustic mat. There's a number of different options on the market for acoustic mat, but essentially they're all doing this. They're creating separation or decoupling that poured concrete or gypsum layer on the top from the mass timber panel below it and creating that separation. The third option that I mentioned is adding noise absorbers. In a mass timber system, many times you won't have the opportunity to do that. An example of a noise absorber would be something like bat insulation. When you do have, say, a drop ceiling or a floor cavity that you can fill with bat insulation, that's a very good and somewhat inexpensive way of improving the acoustics performance of an assembly. Again, with mass timber, because we don't have that floor cavity, it's a solid timber panel. Generally, we're not including noise absorbers. However, if you are doing something like a drop ceiling below a floor ceiling assembly, that would be a place to add noise absorbers. And then there are some instances where project teams have looked at something like a mass timber floor panel with sleepers on top, 2x2, 2x4 sleepers on top, and then that annular space between those sleepers and below the floor sheathing, that could be also a good area to add those noise absorbing materials. As far as the tips and tricks go regarding mass timber acoustics design, this is where I would say definitely pay attention to more than just the assembly. Of course, it's very important to design the assembly for good acoustics performance, but you also need to design for flanking to make sure that you're not allowing flanking to occur. Flanking is essentially when you have noise seeping through air gaps around the perimeter of a room, perimeter of a panel to wall intersection, those types of things. The old adage was where air can flow, sound can flow. So getting good sealing, in some cases you're installing gaskets, isolation strips, those types of things, but making sure that you're not allowing that flanking to occur, because you can design a good mass timber assembly all day long. If there's flanking that's occurring, that assembly is not going to perform to its tested numbers. And lastly, on this topic of mass timber acoustics, I wanted to point out two resources that are available to you right now. The first one is a white paper from WoodWorks that discusses the acoustics design of mass timber assemblies, a lot of what we cover today, as well as quite a bit more. So make sure you check that out, as well as an accompanying document that's really a compendium or a consolidation of all of the acoustically tested mass timber assemblies that we're aware of. There's currently close to 500 acoustically tested mass timber assemblies. Most of these lab tests, some field tests as well. So I believe in that document, you'll also find some good information. Of course, though, we recognize that these two resources aren't going to provide all of the answers for you from a mass timber acoustics perspective, and that's where we would ask you to reach out to us here at WoodWorks. We're a free resource. Let us help you with these types of questions for your mass timber project. Let us know how we can help going forward. Well, I thank you so much for making it to the end of today's video. Until next time, we'll see you later.